What is a day in the life of a Buddhist monastery like?
Daily monastic rituals vary somewhat according to place and denomination. Theravada monasteries revolve around the chanting of scriptures from the first two baskets, the Vinaya and Sutra Pitakas, after waking at around 3 a.m. Members lie prostrate together in the oratory to recite the three refuges and chant sutras. They spend several hours in study and meditation before heading out to beg. Breakfast precedes more communal chanting and a class on the rules of discipline. Supper is scheduled before noon, after which members spend the afternoon studying scripture and resting. More chanting, study, and prayer, along with a chance to once again examine the conscience and confess faults, bring the day to a close by 10. Theravada monks in many areas engage in considerable social service activity, assisting villagers in various kinds of practical projects and in community organization. In places like Japan, monks leave the monastery on a quest for alms, that is, more a symbolic reminder of their dependence than a substantial necessity. Daily order is strictly regulated with relatively little time for individual activities. Certain days are designated for shaving and bathing. Zen monks engage in periods of manual labor around the monastery, such as gardening, gathering fuel, and general maintenance, and place greater emphasis on silent meditation than on recitation of scriptural texts. Each month a whole week is dedicated to virtually round-the-clock zazen, or sitting meditation, together in the same hall where the monks sleep. Monastic life generally allows sufficient sleep and nutritious food to maintain good health, but nothing superfluous in either case. It is a physically and psychologically demanding life. In most cases, individuals can join a monastery for a time, with the understanding that they do not intend to make a lifelong commitment to it.
What are some basic clues about the iconography of the major deities?
Walk through the Asian galleries of your local museum, or visit a Hindu temple, and chances are good that you will spot some of the following images. Shiva's main symbol is the short pillar-like object called the linga, which, together with the female yoni, represents divine creative power. But you may also find Shiva Natraja, Dance King, surrounded by a ring of fire, cosmic flux, and trouncing the demon of ignorance. His upper right hand holds the drum whose sound is that of creation. His upper left the fire of destruction. His lower left points to the earth, the lower right raised in a gesture of reassurance. From his head flows the Ganges, whose fall to earth Shiva breaks with his matted locks. You may find his beloved mount, the bull Nandi, nearby. Shiva may also appear seated with his very voluptuous wife, Parvati, and their very human-looking son Skanda. There Shiva will hold an axe and a deer as symbols of his lordship over nature. You may also see the combined male and female Shiva Parvati called half-woman Lord. Their other son, Ganesha, is the one with the elephant head and pot belly. He holds a bowl of sweets in one hand, and in the other one of his own tusks, which he is about to hurl at the demon who made fun of him. His vehicle is a mouse or rat, an obvious dash of humor. Vishnu may appear alone or with his wife, Lakshmi. He typically carries the conch shell, capable of making a world-shuddering sound, the discus, a weapon for cutting enemies off at the knees, and the mace, while raising a fourth hand in reassurance. Vishnu's most popular avatar, Krishna, frequently plays his world-charming flute. With his legs crossed jauntily in a dance step. His beloved Radha often appears with him. Rama is the second most important avatar, recognizable by his bow when standing alone, but usually seen in company of his wife Sita, his brother Lakshmana, and their faithful monkey assistant Hanuman.
What observances are linked with seasonal cycles?
The so-called rain retreat, Vasa, begins on the day after the full moon day of the 8th lunar month, Asada, July/August, and continues until the full moon day of the 11th lunar month Ashvina, September/October. Monks spend more time in meditation and study and are expected to remain in the monastery. Lay Buddhists visit temples and monasteries more frequently than usual to receive instruction. And marriages are generally not performed. Theravada Buddhists begin the season with monastic ordinations and end it with special merit rituals said to be in memory of Buddha's emergence from heaven. Also at the end of the retreat comes the festival called Kadana, cloth. During this joyous month-long festivity, lay people give the monks new robes and other useful gifts. This is a favored time for pilgrimages to Southeast Asian sites such as Rangoon's Shui Dagon Temple and Thailand's Shrine of the Buddha's Footprint. In connection with the rice harvest in February or March, Theravada devotees make merit by celebrating the story of how the Buddha to be entered the world as Prince Vesantara in a previous incarnation.
What are parent and established and universal religious communities?
From the distant perspective of at least several centuries we can look back into history in search of the origins of major religious traditions. Though we will never be entirely sure in some cases when a given tradition actually began, or when it became distinct enough from its religious surroundings to be identifiable as a separate entity, we can develop some useful general notions. But it helps to keep in mind that most of our judgments in this regard are quite relative.
What do deists believe about the goal of human life?
Although the principal early sacred texts do not discuss prospects of life after death explicitly, the question of immortality turned into an important issue for deists. Archaeological evidence from well over 3,000 years ago suggests that many people believed in some sort of survival after death, but that apparently meant a kind of extended earthly existence. Religious Taoism does not always make the distinction. Some traditions make between life here and life hereafter. Some deists have held views not unlike those of many Christians, believing that at death life is changed, not taken away. But many have argued that if indeed life is a seamless reality, it may be possible to go on indefinitely without crossing that great divide called death. Whatever specific imagery deists have used to describe the nature of human life, the underlying point is that the tradition has been keenly interested in promoting a sense of vitality, and in helping adherents to develop a positive attitude to the human condition generally.
Do Buddhists mark their sacred spaces with any distinctive signs and symbols?
Though Buddhist ritual spaces vary a great deal architecturally and decoratively from one region to another, a number of commonly used signs and symbols appear. Perhaps the single most important is the eight-spoked wheel of the Dharma, reminder of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path. Tibetan temples identify themselves with a characteristic form of the classical Indian stupa called a chorten, a five-level architectural form crowned with a conical shape. Chinese Buddhist temples borrowed their ground plans from the traditional royal residence, a walled enclosure with one or more interior courtyards surrounding the main sacred structures. The principal inner structures face south and are lined up on an axis with the main gate. A multi-storied polygonal pagoda may be part of the complex. Japan largely borrowed the classical Chinese ground plan, varying the placement of the inner buildings somewhat. Always found at the back of the walled enclosure is the main image hall where central rituals occur. 3-5 or 7-story square pagodas are irregular feature in the main courtyard of many Japanese temples. Thai temples feature a very distinctive roofline and post very imposing guardian figures before the main door but do not generally have separate pagoda structures.
What do Muslims believe about God?
God is one, transcendent, and wholly unlike anything in ordinary human experience. But such a bare-bones description of ultimate reality leaves little for the human heart to grasp. Muslim tradition speaks of God most of all through the 99 beautiful names. Compassionate and merciful are by far the most important of these. They occur in the phrase "in the name of God, the compassionate." The merciful, with which all but one of the surahs of the Quran begin. Whatever devout Muslims do, they dedicate with that phrase. God's names include about equally those that suggest divine power and majesty, Jalal, pronounced Jalaal, and those that speak of his beauty and infinite attractiveness, Jamal, pronounced Jamal. God both brings to life and causes to die, gives freely and calls all creation to account. Non-Muslims often have the mistaken impression that the Islamic God is most of all a fearsome, even despotic, power before whom all must cower and cringe. To the contrary, while Muslims are ever aware of God's uncontested sovereignty and dominion over all things, they believe as well that, as the Quran teaches, God is closer to individual persons than even their jugular vein. Muslim tradition reminds believers that, in the end, God's mercy outweighs his anger. Scores of hadiths describe this God of mercy in such beautiful and moving terms that any outsider who studies them can readily understand why so many Muslims find devotion to such a deity so compelling.
What is the principal Muslim sacred text?
In about the year 610, Muhammad began to deliver orally the messages he believed were of divine origin. His recitation, Quran, of the revelation was initially held in memory by his followers, and, according to traditional accounts, was not produced in full written form until some years after Muhammad's death in 632. What began as an Arabic recitation retained that name even after it was written down, and the resulting book is still known as the Recitation or Quran.
What are some of the main types of religious officials or specialists?
Most traditions develop distinctive roles for specialists in the practice and preservation of ritual, the interpretation and implementation of rules, the works of teaching and pastoral guidance, and internal services and social outreach. In some traditions, a single individual sometimes plays multiple roles, depending on the size of the local community. Division of labor typically occurs in larger communities and often requires extensive financial support. Ritual specialists play a crucial role in most traditions, but particularly in those having elaborate liturgies or other ritual practices. Some traditions, such as Hinduism, Roman Catholicism, and Shinto, maintain full-time priestly staffs at their larger institutions whose task is to serve the community and see that the main rituals are handed down intact. Traditions that have their own internal systems of law often train legal specialists for extensive administrative duties. Communities that establish their own educational systems often train teachers, administrators, and directors of religious education for their schools. Members of some traditions also look to their specialists for pastoral guidance in time of difficulty. Some religious leaders take on the role of counselor or spiritual guide, helping individuals and families through crises such as grieving or loss of employment. Related to these services are a host of community-based activities that, in larger local communities, can require a full-time director or social worker.
What is sectarian Shinto?
"13 principal sects comprise what is generally referred to as sectarian or sect, Kyoha, Shinto. Arising over the centuries and officially recognized in the early 20th century. The 13 cluster around 5 themes or emphases. First, 2 groups that emphasize purification are known as Misaji-kyo and Shinshu-kyo. Kyo means teaching or school. Fuzukyo, Jikokyo, and Onteikyo are called mountain sects because they centered around cults of 2 sacred mountains, Fuji and Onteik. They restructured along distinctively Shinto lines the teachings of several earlier ascetically oriented groups called Shugendo. 3 more recent sects have focused on faith healing. Kurozumai-kyo, Tenri-kyo, and Kanko-kyo all trace their origins to a founding figure. 2 sects called Shinto Shoseiha and Shinto Taisei-kyo have emphasized Confucian elements and have blended features of the purification and mountain sects as well. Finally, among the 13 are the most recent groups, whose mission has been to renew Shinto tradition. These are Izumo Oyashiro-kyo, Shinri-kyo, and Shinto Tai-kyo. The latter is an umbrella organization that was largely responsible for the official recognition of the 13. From these sects, dozens of smaller movements have arisen in recent times.
Chances are you won't catch yourself saying, "Nice story, but did it really happen?"
Yet that is exactly how many people respond to ancient mythic narratives. Either it happened just that way or it's the product of some overworked imagination. Once again, it helps to recall a fundamental principle in the study of classic texts. First, determine how the text is trying to communicate. Myth and poetry share another key feature: they are far more about value and meaning, about why things are the way they are, than about fact. Police reports are about facts. It makes perfect sense to ask whether what is alleged there really happened. Myth, on the other hand, arises out of profound reflection on the human condition and on the nature of the world. Myth invariably articulates a vision of the underlying spiritual causes of things, typically personifying those causes as superhuman powers. In technologically advanced societies, the creative imagination can be too readily discredited. But it is virtually impossible to understand how a religion works without a deep appreciation of the imagination. Finally, myth has the power to bring a most welcome element of humor into religious thinking. Thanks to myth at its best, religious people have hope of not taking themselves too seriously.
How do Jews conduct their regular communal liturgical worship?
A feature of ritual practice common to all Jewish congregations is the reading of Scripture. Ancient Palestinian custom used a cycle in which Sabbath readings completed the whole Torah in a 3-year cycle. Some Reform and conservative communities have reinstituted that practice in recent times. Orthodox and Reconstructionist congregations continue to use the ancient Babylonian custom of a 1-year cycle of 54 Siddharim. On Mondays, Thursdays, and Sabbath mornings and afternoons, as well as on new moons and special religious festivals, Jews read Torah in the synagogue. Regular Sabbath readings follow the Torah in order, continuously, from Genesis through Deuteronomy. Readings for the various feasts and fasts are chosen specially for the occasion and do not follow a continuous cycle. In addition, texts from the former and latter prophets, but not from the writings, are selected as a kind of parallel or commentary on the day's Torah texts. These supplementary readings, used on Sabbaths, fasts, and feasts, are called Haftarah. Some theorize that the practice of parallel readings originated during Seleucid times when persecution included a ban on Torah reading. Communal prayer adds to the regular prayers of the privately performed Amidah the Kedushah, triple holy. At the end of the third benediction in morning and afternoon, as well as the Kaddish. Holy in Aramaic, to mark the end of the various segments of the communal prayer and to bring it to a close. The standard prayer book for synagogue worship is called the Siddur. Order, which is based on the Psalter. The first formal edition dates back to about the 9th century CE.
What were the earliest Hindu sacred texts?
A set of sacred scriptures, called the Vedas, consists of 4 distinct collections of texts, each with its own distinctive purpose. The name Veda comes from a Sanskrit root meaning wisdom or vision. The same root that gives us English words like video. According to tradition, seers, called rishis, composed the texts and communicated them orally. The rishis were able to see the truths revealed to them because they were also hearers of the sacred word. In fact, Hindu tradition groups the most sacred of its scriptures in the category of that which is heard, Shruti, to distinguish them from a secondary level of revelation called that which is remembered, Smriti. The Vedas evolved over a period of centuries, and religious specialists eventually wrote them down in an ancient form of Sanskrit. The earliest and most important of the 4 scriptures is called the Rig Veda, an anthology of more than 1,000 hymns to various deities. A second collection, called the Samaveda, includes material from the Rig, edited for ease of ritual use according to melodies and poetic meters. In the Yajurveda, the early priesthood gathered the most important sacred mantras. A final collection of ritual incantations makes up the Atharva Veda. Many of the Vedic hymns are especially beautiful and offer a unique insight into how the early ritual specialists who made up the priesthood sought to understand and affect their world through contact with forces beyond human control.
How do Shinto practitioners celebrate birth?
Not long after a couple have a baby, traditionally about 30 days, they take the child to the shrine for a natal blessing. This is consistent with the belief that all new ventures and beginnings will fare better if brought before the kami. In addition, the symbolism includes the belief that the infant thus becomes a child of the family's protector kami. Parents arrange with shrine staff for a standard ceremony that takes place inside the hayden, or outer worship hall. At larger shrines, a senior priest, assistant priest, and miko typically perform the ceremony, pronouncing solemn prayers in an archaic Japanese. The priests then perform blessings over the young family by waving the harigushi. The miko may also participate by blessing the worshippers with a green sakeke branch. Ancient Shinto tradition retains a class of divine beings called kami of birth or beginnings, Musubi no kami. They include kami of fire, youth, plenty, and the creator divinities who brought all things to birth.
Do deists and practitioners of CCT make pilgrimages?
Pilgrimage has long been integral to most of the major Chinese religious traditions. The Chinese term typically translated as making pilgrimage, Chao Shan Jin Xiang, actually means paying respects to a mountain by presenting incense. Beginning in at least the 4th century CE and growing dramatically from the 8th to 12th centuries, pilgrimage practices of the various traditions came to be identified with certain specific mountains, with some mountains claimed by more than one tradition. Once identified as a particularly sacred place, a mountain became the site of one or more temples. Eventually, deists and others developed elaborate sacred geographies, mapped out with reference to the major sacred peaks or ranges. Pilgrimage to the sacred mountains thus became a symbolic journey through the universe. On some mountains, such as Wudangshan, deists have constructed miniature versions of the macro cosm, identifying its subdivisions with such enchanting names as Jade Void, Primordial Harmony, Purple Empyrean, and Perfect Felicity. Mountains are the dwelling places of the gods and immortals, and as such, naturally became favorite places of retreat for deist scholars and masters. Mountain settings have other, more primal, symbolism for deists as well. They embody the perfect harmony of male yang and female yin. Deep within mountain caves, spiritual seekers could contact the eternal feminine energies. Popular pilgrimage has generally revolved around visits to the mountain temples rather than around extended spiritual retreat. A deity called generically the Old Man of the Mountain, often depicted with his pet tiger, appears in many temples all over Asia, including Buddhist sites, making a symbolic pilgrimage possible even for those who cannot manage the actual journey. Today, various organizations arrange pilgrimage tours to any of several dozen sacred sites in the People's Republic and in Taiwan.
Was Islam especially important in medieval Spain?
Not long after Arab troops began to occupy the Iberian Peninsula, Muslim princes, called amirs, literally commanders, pronounced emir, established themselves in major cities. In 750 the Abbasids sought to put an end to their Umayyad rivals by assassinating all of the family's princes. One managed to escape and take refuge in Spain. This Abdar Rahman proclaimed himself Amir of Córdoba, still holding aloft the Umayyad standard. His successors eventually broke with Baghdad definitively by proclaiming the Umayyad Caliphate of Córdoba. A major step up from an Amirate, the Caliphate laid claim to the universal allegiance of all Muslims. For several centuries Córdoba would be a marvel of cultural splendor and interreligious harmony. On the whole, Córdoba was an outstanding example of how Jews, Christians, and Muslims could live together in peace under Muslim rule. Islam's presence was highly visible in other Spanish cities as well. Seville became an important political and cultural center. As Córdoba receded in importance in the mid-11th century, Christian reconquest of Spain gradually retook ground from Muslim rule, from Toledo to Córdoba to Seville. Granada would remain the last stronghold of Islam until the armies of Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella took the legendary Alhambra in 1492. Nearly 8 centuries of Islamic presence in Spain left a rich religious and cultural heritage. 500 years after the fall of Granada, small communities of Muslims are once again taking root in Spain.
What were some critical events in Islam's earliest years?
Over the next 23 years or so, Muhammad continued to preach the word God had spoken directly to him. At the heart of the message was the notion of surrender. The root meaning of the Arabic word Islam, pronounced Islam, to the one true God. His early preaching called for social justice and equality and condemned oppression of the poor by the wealthy and powerful. Muhammad belonged to a powerful tribe called the Quraysh, who exercised considerable control over the lives of the Meccans generally. But Muhammad's family and the clan of which they were a part were among the poorer and less influential within the tribe. Muhammad's preaching did not endear him to the Quraysh, who made life difficult for the small community of Muslims. In 622, Muhammad and his followers made the crucial decision to move north to the city of Yathrib, whose representatives had offered the young community sanctuary. This emigration or hijra marked the official beginning of the Muslim calendar. Muhammad the Prophet became a statesman as well, and Yathrib became known as Madinat an-Nabi, the city of the Prophet, or Medina for short. The Muslim community grew rapidly, doing battle with the Meccans and eventually regaining access to Mecca in 630.
Do Muslims follow specific dietary customs or rituals?
Muslim dietary practice is similar in many ways to Jewish traditions known as kashrut, or keeping kosher. Certain foods are forbidden altogether, except in direst need. These include intoxicating beverages, pork, blood, foods prepared or cooked with pork fat. Some would include, for example, donuts and other fried breads, and animals that eat mainly carrion, i.e., scavengers. If non-Muslims invite Muslim friends for a celebration with a meal, it is important that they give due consideration to what they will serve. Muslims do not require the separation of meats from dairy products as do Orthodox Jews. But hosts should avoid pork of any kind if at all possible. Meat of certain animals is acceptable only when the animal has been ritually slaughtered. As in every Muslim ritual, one begins by declaring the intention to perform the action religiously. After pronouncing the first part of the Basmala, in the name of God, leaving off the names compassionate and merciful, and the takbir, God is supreme, the butcher severs the jugular and windpipe with a single blade stroke. The idea is to drain as much of the blood as possible, for it symbolizes the life force. By custom, Muslims in various places consider certain foods traditional for special occasions, such as the meal that breaks the daily fast of Ramadan and the celebration that marks the end of that month. Many of these customs are inspired by Muhammad's own practice. For example, he is said to have broken his daily fast with a glass of water, and a few dates before taking a meal, so Muslims generally try to do likewise.
Have Buddhists always depicted the Buddha in painting and sculpture?
For generations after the Buddha's death, his followers hesitated to depict the teacher in human form. Perhaps they avoided direct visual representation out of respect for the Buddha, one too sacred to be so portrayed. Whatever the motivation, early Buddhist artists chose a variety of symbols to represent the Buddha. Early Christian artists likewise refrained from depicting Christ in human form, opting for symbols like the fish and the empty cross. The most important symbols for the Buddha included the riderless horse, the parasol, the tree, the empty throne, footprints, the eight-spoked wheel, and the stupa. A riderless horse recalled the Buddha's renunciation and departure from his father's palace. Parasols were symbols of royalty and represented the great honor due to an enlightened one. Buddha reached enlightenment beneath the bo tree. And artists often left a space before the tree to suggest the presence of the Buddha. Some scenes place an empty throne beneath the tree. Artists sometimes choose to show a pair of footprints just in front of the throne. Footprints also appear by themselves somewhere in a scene to indicate where the Buddha would have been. A wheel of 8 spokes was a reminder of the Eightfold Noble Path and the Four Noble Truths. Depictions of a stupa, resting place of the Buddha's remains, frequently served as a reminder of his spiritual presence. Several other items especially popular in China among the 8 auspicious signs include a pair of fish, symbol of universal Indian monarchy, the lotus blossom of purity, and the conch shell of victory. Chinese Buddhist altars often held clay or carved wooden images of these symbols.
What is the ceremony of a Japanese wedding?
Contemporary Japanese weddings are celebrated in many ways, often combining traditional Japanese and Western elements side by side. Typically, a religious wedding ceremony is performed in Shinto style at a shrine located inside the hotel where the wedding celebration occurs. The ceremony is conducted by a Shinto priest and is attended only by the couple's closest family members. The couple is purified, drinks sake, and the groom reads a statement of commitment. The ceremony ends with symbolic offerings to the kami. The couple wears traditional Japanese garb. A reception is usually held after the ceremony. The wedding couple might welcome anywhere from 15 to 250 guests, relatives, friends, and co-workers. After the bride and groom are introduced, a meal is served and brief speeches are delivered. At the end of the party, the couple thank their guests for joining them on this important day. In recent years, many Japanese couples have incorporated traditionally Western elements into their weddings, for example, brides wearing white, Christian-style dresses. Sometimes the entire ceremony takes place in a Christian church and, according to a Christian-like ritual, even when the couple is not Christian. Many couples also perform other Western-style rituals, including cake cutting, an exchange of rings, and elaborate honeymoons.
What are the origins and practices of Zionism?
Near the end of the 19th century, many Jews in Eastern Europe began to view Israel as more than just a place for pilgrimages or for occasional settlement by strong believers. Encouraged by the rise of nationalism in Europe, certain Jews sought to return to the land of their ancestors and to make their homes there. This impulse gave rise to the political movement known as Zionism. The expression comes from the word Zion, which is a poetic term for the Holy Land. Zionists see Jews as more than a loosely bound group of religious believers. Politically, Zionists argue that Jews are bound to the land to Israel and that they were chosen for a role that is inextricably connected with Abraham. During the 1930s, with the rise of Nazism, this view became more urgent and provoked heated debate about the nature of Judaism.
Have there been any important Muslim religious reformers?
According to a hadith, Muslims believe that at the beginning of each Islamic century God will raise up for the community a mujaddid, pronounced mujahid, a renewer who calls people to a fresh awareness of their faith. Muslim tradition has identified a succession of important historical renewers. In modern times, too, a number of major reformers have taken on the daunting task of inciting their fellow religionists to adapt their ancient faith heritage to changing circumstances. Like reformers in any tradition, these Muslim pioneers have often met with resistance to the changes they proposed. Muhammad Abduh, 1849–1905, for example, worked to promote reason as nearly equal with revelation as a source of knowledge. His suggestion that some elements of the Quran were not of divine origin caused considerable stir. Abduh, nevertheless, served as Grand Mufti of Egypt and was a leading influence at the Al-Azhar University, a flagship institution of Islamic traditionalism.
Have Jews used symbolism to remind them of the temple since its destruction in 70 CE?
Many illuminated manuscripts of the Bible and other important Hebrew texts have included a 1 or 2 page spread depicting the various implements or ritual objects once used in the temple. These pages show all of the more portable items mentioned in the text of Exodus 25–30. They include, among other things, the tablets of the law, the menorah, the table supporting the containers of the 12 loaves of sacred bread, a bronze laver used for ceremonial purification, the ram's horn, shofar, and the incense burner. Decorative panels or hangings, called mizrach or east since they are hung on a home's eastern wall toward Jerusalem, also frequently depict a building meant to be the Jerusalem temple. Sometimes these hangings show temple implements rather than the building itself. The mizrach is a reminder not only of the ancient temple, but of the holy city of Jerusalem, toward which Jews turn when they pray. Another ritual object that often uses imagery of the temple is the Hanukkah lamp. Though some lamps look very much like the standard 7-branch menorah, many take the form of a small architectural design that can be either hung on the wall or set on a table. The architectural imagery sometimes depicts the back interior wall of a synagogue, with its arch flanked by 2 pillars meant to recall the 2 pillars of the temple representing Boaz and Jachin. Sometimes the Hanukkah lamp bears an elaborate architectural facade. The metalsmith is version of what the temple looked like.
What is the religious meaning of the term relic?
A relic is a physical reminder of the ongoing spiritual presence of some important religious figure. In that sense, one could say a relic is a type of sign. The most important relics are generally portions of the bodily remains of the holy person, including bones or bone fragments, teeth, skulls, cremated ashes, or even fingernails. A secondary type of relic includes items believed to have belonged to the holy person, such as pieces of clothing, books, jewelry. Even items said merely to have been touched by the holy person often carry a special significance. Some traditions even put particular meaning in possessing footprints said to have been left by the holy person, even though in most instances the prints are clearly either highly stylized symbolic artifacts or impressions left in stone scarcely identifiable as footprints. The most important reliquaries are the actual tombs of holy persons. Assuming the remains were never removed in the interest of creating multiple relics to be spread abroad. Sites that claim ownership of the relics of one, or sometimes very many, holy persons frequently become destinations for pilgrims. The idea of a cult of relics strikes many as a rather ghoulish practice. And the sight of a barely preserved waxen cadaver under glass can indeed evoke morbid thoughts. But the use of relics is so common that some appreciation of how they function is essential to the study of religion.
What does the word conversion mean?
From the Latin convertere, meaning to turn about, conversion is a process of dramatic change. Religious conversion can mean a transfer of allegiance or membership from one religious tradition to another. When a conversion is formal or official, it can involve a repudiation of one's former beliefs. But it often means an affirmation of membership in the convert's new group. Many converts change from having no particular religious affiliation to active engagement in a community of faith. Recognition of a convert's acceptance into a new community varies widely. Some traditions require elaborate and lengthy preparation, including indoctrination in the new belief system, culminating in special ceremonies of initiation. Other traditions require minimal preparation and may mark a new member's acceptance with a simple welcoming announcement to the gathered congregation. Some traditions actively seek converts while others are not at all aggressive in this respect. Another kind of conversion is equally important. Great religious figures in many traditions talk of soul-shaking experiences that leave them searching for a new way of recommitting themselves spiritually. They often describe a dramatic change of heart that results not in their leaving one community of faith for another, but in a renewal and deeper understanding of their original faith commitments.
Is there a Confucian or CIT creed?
Neither Confucianism as such nor CIT have ever formulated a specific creedal statement to which all members are expected to confess their allegiance. If asked to summarize his or her religious beliefs, a devout and well-informed Chinese man or woman of a century or two ago would likely have included a number of basic elements relating to Confucianism and CIT. Divine heaven rules all things through a mandate made known to a son of heaven called the emperor. The emperor in turn governs all earthly affairs by enacting that mandate, whose hallmark is justice and equity. It is the emperor's duty to make timely and appropriate offerings to heaven and earth, to ensure the felicitous coordination of all cosmic events for the benefit of humankind. Confucius, as one of the sages, represents a revered tradition of practical wisdom to which a sincere emperor subscribes. All good subjects, too, will acknowledge the sage and those of his stature and will venerate them along with their own ancestors. All of this, they might add, fits into the larger picture of the ultimate harmony represented by the balance of all things under the power of the Dao, which is manifest in heaven and earth.
Is there a central teaching authority for Buddhists?
No single individual or institutional center claims central authority to all Buddhists. Not long after the Buddha's death, various interpretations of his teaching gave rise to distinct schools of thought, and eventually, of practice. Perhaps the closest approximation to centralized authority in the history of Buddhism are the various councils convened over many centuries. Most Buddhists concur on the authority of the first three monastic convocations, convened about a century apart, with the first only months after the Buddha's death. Members took up a range of issues, from the particulars of monastic discipline to the shape of the canonical scriptures, to doctrinal differences. But Buddhists disagree on the number of authentic councils. And even the universally acknowledged councils have exercised limited authority. Today, many non-Buddhists think immediately of the Dalai Lama as a major Buddhist leader and authority figure. Even though the Dalai Lama has enormous moral authority and commands the respect of Buddhists in many communities, his role remains quite different from that of the Pope or the College of Cardinals in Roman Catholicism.
Who are some important women in the history of Hindu spirituality?
Ancient tradition acknowledges that some anonymous women were among the authors of the Vedic hymns. Many other women whose names we know have made major contributions throughout the history of Hinduism. Here is a brief introduction to 4 of the better-known women from various denominations. Antal, 725–55 CE, was one of the Alvars, poet saints in the Vaishnava tradition. She was most famous for poetry in which she described her relationship with Vishnu in the language of bridal mysticism. Seeing herself as the spouse of Vishnu, she shares the spiritual longing of women mystics in other traditions who speak of total loving union with God. Devotees still sing hymns that set her poems to music. Mahadevi was a 12th century devotee of Shiva and a renowned poet in the Kannada language. In the temple of her village, the principal deity was a form of Shiva called Mallikarjun, Lord White as Jasmine. Like Antal, she thought of herself as betrothed to God alone. She was apparently forced into an unhappy marriage, and much of her poetry alludes to the suffering she experienced and her longing to be liberated and live for God alone. A late medieval holy woman named Mirabai, 1498–1550, was a devotee of Krishna. She thought of herself as a gopi who had been hopelessly enamored of the dark Lord. After extricating herself from an unsatisfactory marriage, she became a sannyasi and composed love songs in Hindi, a vernacular tongue in west-central India. Finally, a woman known by the honorific title Anandamayi Ma, bliss-steeped mother, lived in modern-day Bengal, now Bangladesh. Nirmala Sundari, 1896–1982, lived a most colorful life, often flouting strict tradition in favor of sometimes highly symbolic or ecstatic behavior. In her later years she opted for a more settled life, founding an ashram and ministering to disciples who sought her out for spiritual guidance.
What is the meaning of Torah? Do Jews believe Moses wrote it all? What about oral Torah?
Torah is a Hebrew word generally translated teaching or instruction. In reference to the Hebrew scriptures, Torah means the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. According to tradition, Moses himself composed the whole of the Torah under divine inspiration. This ancient attribution has the benefit of lending maximum authority to the earliest sacred texts by association with the man most identified with the divine revelation that shaped the faith community known as Judaism. Modern scholarship has demonstrated convincingly the historical improbability of the traditional attribution. In its most general sense, Torah means revealed or divine law, all that God requires of Jews. But as the Jewish community has grown and spread, moving into new lands and cultural settings, interpreting the scriptural Torah in practical terms has presented challenges. When Ezra led a group of Jews back to Israel from exile in Babylon in the late 6th century BCE, he confronted a problem: many Jews no longer knew Hebrew. In order to teach them the Torah, Ezra commissioned scholars who could translate the Torah into Aramaic as it was being read aloud to the people. That translation, or paraphrase, was itself a kind of commentary on the sacred text. Thus began the phenomenon called oral Torah. From the 5th century BCE on, classes of special scholars would oversee its elaboration. One generation would pass oral tradition down to the next until it became so extensive that it had to be written down to be preserved. Then a new class of scholars would initiate commentary on the now written oral law, extending the process further, until once again the burgeoning oral tradition had to be committed to writing or be lost forever.
How do deists worship at home and throughout the day when they are not in temples?
Worshippers perform at home many of the same rituals they perform in the temple. Home shrines or family altars are miniature versions of the temple's sacred objects. Smaller images of the various deities enjoy places of honor. Before the image, family members place a few apples or oranges, for example. And small incense pots hold small burning sticks just as the kettle in the temple courtyard does. Many devout Chinese begin their day by offering incense to the terrestrial deity of the home, who is sometimes depicted as 5 separate figures recalling the 5 elements. This earth deity is at the bottom of an administrative flow chart, reporting to the district deity, who in turn reports to the city god, and he to the country god. Offerings to family ancestors and consultation with an almanac as to the spiritual qualities of the particular day are other regular rituals. Many private individuals still practice Tai Chi Chuan, a set of rhythmic movements designed to balance yin and yang and maximize energy.
Why do some Jews touch their door frames when they enter their homes?
Jewish households often display a mezuzah, doorpost, at the front door and sometimes at interior doorways as well. Upon entering the house, they reverently touch this small container of scriptural texts from Deuteronomy 6:4-9 and 11:13-21. The first of these texts includes the Shema, the brief creedal formula. Part of that text, 6:9, also instructs Jews to write the words of Scripture on their doorposts and gates.
What is comparative religion?
Comparative religion draws on the information supplied by all available sources for the history of religion. Scholars look for possible parallels between one tradition and another in the belief that common themes can offer insights into how the traditions developed and how their teachings differ or reinforce one another. We can talk, for example, about what kinds of beliefs and practices are characteristic of a tradition, how various communities of faith are organized, what sorts of signs and symbols a tradition uses to express its central teachings, and what kinds of special calendars different traditions follow. Comparative religion is not just about looking for similarities. Differences are every bit as important. And in the end, what we're seeking is greater insight built on an overall picture that is as fair and balanced as good scholarship can provide.
Are doctrine and dogma important to Muslims?
Islamic tradition centers on the relatively compact body of beliefs summed up in the Shahada. Straightforward affirmation of God's unity and transcendence, and divine communication through a succession of prophet messengers, are the core of doctrine. Further basic elements that flow from these core doctrines include, especially, belief in God's use of angels as helpers and guides, resurrection of the body, personal accountability at judgment, and ultimate reward or punishment in heaven or hell in the next world. Since there is no central teaching authority, Muslims do not think in terms of official, dogmatic formulations of their beliefs. Simplicity is the key. So long as one prefaces every act of faith with proper intention, one can be assured of pursuing the path God has revealed. In other words, Islamic tradition emphasizes orthopraxy over orthodoxy.
What does serpent handling have to do with Christianity?
Several small, mostly rural, churches in the United States have focused their worship life around the unusual and dangerous practice of handling poisonous snakes. They take their cue from Mark 16:18, according to which a sign of those who believe in Jesus is that they will take up serpents. Worship gatherings in these churches involve intensely emotional prayer and increasingly agitated music and dancing. People toward the front of the church who feel so moved will remove a poisonous snake, or even two, from their containers, holding them up at face level while dancing around the room. Some say it is the music and motion that prevent the serpents from striking. Rattlesnakes seem to be the serpent of choice, perhaps because the noise they make with their tails adds to the drama and because the rattling might warn of an imminent strike. Copperheads and water moccasins are also sometimes used. Many worshippers have been bitten, some many times, and more than a few have died. But that in no way deters worshippers from continuing the practice. Ever in search of perfect faith and trust in God.
Take away the soul and what remains?
Nothing, apparently. But the Buddha was not attempting to empty life of its meaning. He wanted people to change their minds about what matters most. Look hard at what motivates you. What can make you nearly desperate to achieve this good or avoid that evil? Look carefully, the Buddha argued. and you will see that the qualities that attract or repel you are deceptions. Probe deeply into your choices and you will see that what you are really looking for you cannot get from this possession or that person. Each being is simply what it is, and it is a serious mistake to treat your world as though it existed for you. As if what you value in each thing is its value. In a sense, the Buddha argued, all things are empty. In that they simply do not possess the soul that a grasping, craving person invests them with. Pile all your expectations onto some person or object as though you truly hope it will deliver what you want. And you are making the fundamental mistake. The notion of non-soul, anatman, is difficult to understand. But it is one of the Buddha's most provocative teachings.
How big is the Quran and how is it organized?
The sacred scripture contains about 6,000 verses, roughly equivalent in length to the New Testament. Arranged in 114 sections called surahs, pronounced surah. Muhammad's earliest revelations tend to be short, rhetorically potent utterances in an ancient form of rhymed prose used by pre-Islamic seers and soothsayers. Later surahs tend to be lengthier and more prosaic, and often take up more practical concerns. Surahs are arranged in more or less descending order of length, so that many of the earlier sections are actually in the latter part of the book now. The heading of each surah contains the title, number of verses, and an indication as to whether it was revealed at Mecca or Medina. Interpreters consider it very important to place each text historically. For the circumstances of the revelation are critical in unwrapping its original meaning. Tradition has identified the surahs, or portions of them where it is clear that a single surah is actually a composite, as early, middle, or late Meccan, 610 to 622, or Medinan, 622 to 632. Muslims believe the Quran is the direct, literal word of God, unmodified in any way by the Prophet who uttered them at God's bidding.
What signs or symbols distinguish Muslim ritual or religious specialists?
There is no ordained Muslim clergy as such, but a category of specialists, known as religious scholars, sometimes wear distinctive garb. Style and color generally depend on variant traditions in the country of origin. Many religious scholars from many lands prefer the fez wrapped in the white cloth, signifying that the wearer has made Hajj. Some, from the Sudan for example, wear a white turban. Shiite mullahs and higher-ranking scholars in Iran and Iraq often wear a black turban that identifies them as Sayyids. Descendants of Muhammad through his daughter Fatima and her husband, Ali. Size, color, number of turns, and so forth, allow a practiced eye to distinguish national and sectarian connections. Members of Sufi orders often wear special clothing, particularly during their prayer gatherings. Various organizations have unique headgear, sometimes using colors or varied ways of wrapping the basic cap with windings to indicate rank or status within the order.
Do Hindus really believe in and worship many gods?
Hindu tradition uses language and symbolism that seems at first glance to suggest what is called polytheism, worship of many deities. Most Hindus, however, will tell you they believe in God, one transcendent spiritual reality. Since human beings are incapable of grasping the fullness of divine truth in anything like a comprehensive and definitive way, believers are left with a basic choice: either they keep quiet about matters of faith and belief altogether, since the realities will forever elude ordinary language and symbolism, or they indulge in ordinary forms of expression, ever aware that those forms will never be adequate. Hindu tradition has become a monument to the second option, and the world of religious belief is all the richer for that.